The prosecutor laid out the evidence and Johnson's confession in detail. The judge listened attentively, his expression stern. Johnson, standing in the dock, looked pale and defeated, no longer able to hide behind his lies. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was firm and authoritative. "Mr. Johnson, the evidence against you is overwhelming. You have committed a heinous crime, and your actions have caused immeasurable pain to this family. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in imprisonment." As the words were declared, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Fancy's mother broke down in tears, clutching her husband's arm, while Fanciful wiped her own eyes, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over her. The police moved quickly, grabbing Johnson by the arms, handcuffing him and dragging him away. He tried to protest, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the crowd. His once arrogant demeanor was now replaced with fear and regret. As Johnson disappeared from sight, the judge's gavel slammed down, signaling the end of the case. Justice had been served, but for Fancy's family, the void left by her absence remained. They left the courtroom, determined to honor her memory and find peace despite the tragedy that had befallen them. Johnson's 15-year sentence was shockingly reduced to just 5 years, leaving Fancy's family feeling that justice had not been fully served. A year had passed since Fancy's tragic death, and her absence continued to leave a void in the hearts of her loved ones. Life at the Okoye household had grown quiet, filled with grief and memories of the daughter they lost. Unknown to the Okoye family, Johnson's story had taken a sinister turn. Behind him was a powerful and wealthy man, his secret benefactor, who had been the buyer of the human parts Johnson supplied. This man, a figure surrounded by secrets, pulled strings to ensure Johnson's freedom. The very day Johnson was sent to prison, the big man made his move. He contacted the officials who had custody of Johnson, offering them an enormous bribe. A significant amount of money was transferred into their accounts, and with greed outweighing their sense of duty, they agreed. "We will release him, sir," one of the officials said over the phone after confirming the payment. Plans were swiftly made to smuggle Johnson out of the prison unnoticed. To cover their tracks, the authorities faked records to make it seem like Johnson was still serving his sentence. Meanwhile, Johnson was flown out of the country under the cover of darkness. By the next morning, Johnson was in a foreign land, far from the watchful eyes of the law. His benefactor ensured his safety, making it appear to the world that Johnson was still locked up in prison. The Okoye family remained unaware of the sinister developments. To them, justice had been served, and they continued mourning Fancy, unaware that the man responsible for their loss was free and living his life far away. But secrets like these don't stay buried forever. Unknown to Johnson and his powerful backer, shadows of their actions were beginning to stir, setting events into motion that would bring their dark deeds to light. It had been a year since Johnson disappeared from prison, secretly flown out of the country by his powerful backer. After living lavishly in London, he decided to return to Nigeria, thinking it was safe. He checked into a luxurious hotel, confident that no one would recognize him. Fanciful, now working at the hotel, was going about her duties when she caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the lounge. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. That must be Johnson, she thought, her eyes narrowing as she tried to get a clearer look at him. The man was seated comfortably, dressed in the latest wares, sipping a drink, and looking far more polished and refreshed than she remembered. "But he's supposed to be in prison," Fanciful muttered under her breath. Her mind raced with doubt. It can't be him. Johnson wouldn't dare show his face here. And besides, he looked so different, so fresh and carefree. Despite her skepticism, something deep inside her whispered that it was indeed him. She stood frozen for a moment, watching him closely as he laughed casually with a waiter. Her thoughts were in turmoil. Am I imagining things? Or could it really be him? She whispered to herself. Fanciful tried to dismiss the thought, convincing herself that she must be mistaken. But her instinct wouldn't let it go. As Johnson sat enjoying himself, completely unaware of her presence, Fanciful decided she needed to investigate further. If it truly was Johnson, then something was terribly wrong. Why was a man who was supposed to be serving time for her sister's death now roaming free? Determined to uncover the truth, she made up her mind to watch him closely and find out if her suspicions were correct. Little did she know, her decision would unravel a web of secrets far darker than she could have ever imagined. The next day, Fanciful found herself once again drawn to the mysterious man staying in room 303. His voice, his mannerisms, and even his walk were too much like Johnson's for her to ignore. This time, she decided to put her doubts to rest. She approached the hotel receptionist, who was busy with her files. "Excuse me," Fanciful said, trying to sound casual, "could you tell me the name of the guest in room 303? The receptionist looked up, slightly hesitant. "Why do you ask?" Fanciful smiled nervously, trying not to appear suspicious. "Oh, it's nothing serious. He just looks familiar, like someone I might know. I just want to be sure." The receptionist nodded and turned to her records. After a brief moment, she said, "His name is Mr. Uche Johnson." Hearing the name, Fanciful's heart sank. Her suspicions were all but confirmed. Johnson had used his real name, likely confident that no one would recognize him here. "Okay, thank you," she replied, trying to mask the shock on her face. She stepped away from the desk, her thoughts racing. It was him, it had to be. But how? He was supposed to be in prison. And what was he doing here, living as if nothing had happened? Fanciful's mind filled with questions and growing anger. She knew she couldn't act rashly, but one thing was clear, she had to get to the bottom of this, and she had to do it without alerting him. If Johnson thought he could escape justice, he was wrong. This time, she would make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. From the day Fanciful decided to investigate the mysterious man, she paid extra attention to every move he made. Though he went by the name Mr. Uche Johnson, she still doubted whether someone as cunning as Johnson would be that careless. Yet, she watched him closely, her instincts telling her she was on the right path. One fateful afternoon, the man was seated in the lounge, casually sipping a drink. He leaned back in his chair, reaching into his pocket for something. As he pulled out a few items, an old passport slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor unnoticed. Fanciful, who had been discreetly watching him from across the room, immediately saw the passport fall. Her heart raced as she quickly walked over. Acting as though she was simply being helpful, she bent down and picked it up. "Excuse me, sir," she said, holding the passport out to him. But as she glanced at the cover, her eyes widened. The name on the passport read Johnson Uche, the same name she feared, the same man responsible for her sister's death. Her hands trembled as she opened the passport slightly, and there it was, his photo, unmistakably the Johnson she remembered. "Oh, he is the one," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible as a wave of shock and anger surged through her. Johnson, noticing her lingering with the passport, casually took it from her hand, unaware of her recognition. "Thank you," he said with a charming smile before tucking it away. Fanciful stood frozen for a moment, her mind spinning. Now, there was no more doubt, Johnson was alive, free, and living a lie. She held her two hands together tightly, silently vowing to expose him and ensure he faced the justice he had escaped. From that moment, she knew she couldn't confront him directly. She needed a plan, one that would bring his dark secrets to light without putting herself in danger. When Fanciful got home that evening, her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she recounted everything she had discovered to her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Okoye listened in shock as she described how Johnson had been living freely, using a false identity, and pretending to be someone else. "We have to act fast," Mr. Okoye said, his voice heavy with anger. "This man must not escape justice again." Early the next morning, they went to the police station to report what Fanciful had uncovered. The officers were attentive, promising swift action. Within hours, they stormed the hotel and arrested Johnson for the second time. This time, they were determined not to let him escape the consequences of his actions. But Johnson's powerful benefactor was not one to let his investment go easily. That same night, a phone call was made, and money exchanged hands once again. By the time the sun rose, Johnson had been quietly released, his name cleared in the official records. When the Okoye family heard the news, they were devastated. Fanciful felt like all her efforts had been in vain. Mrs. Okoye broke down in tears, while her husband paced the room in frustration. "This battle is beyond us," he finally said, his voice low and defeated. Mrs. Okoye nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "We cannot fight someone with this kind of power. We have to let it go and leave it to God." Fanciful looked at her parents, anger and helplessness burning in her chest. "So, that's it. We just give up. After everything he did to Fancy." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, my daughter, the wicked prosper in this world. But their time will come. Justice may be delayed, but it is never denied. Let us leave this in God's hands." Reluctantly, Fanciful agreed. But deep down, she made a silent vow that she would never stop seeking the truth, even if her family had chosen to let go. She knew in her heart that Johnson's actions would not go unpunished forever. Fanciful and her best friend, Blessing, sat in Fanciful's room one evening, plotting their next move against Johnson. Fanciful had refused to let the matter rest, despite her family's decision to move on. She was determined to bring Johnson down, no matter what it took. "Blessing, you're the only one who can help me," Fanciful said, her voice full of urgency. Blessing, a stunning young woman with a charm that could make any man turn his head, smiled confidently. "Don't worry, Fanciful. He won't even know what's coming. We'll make him pay for everything he's done." The plan was simple yet clever. Blessing would position herself as bait to lure Johnson into a trap. Fanciful knew how much Johnson loved women, and Blessing's beauty was enough to catch anyone's attention. They found out where Johnson was staying, a new luxurious hotel not far from the city center. Blessing began showing up every evening, dressed to impress, standing in a spot where Johnson could easily see her. It didn't take long for the plan to work. One evening, as Johnson walked out of the hotel lobby, he noticed Blessing leaning against a nearby railing, scrolling through her phone. Her figure was striking, and her outfit was elegant yet enticing. Johnson, being the charmer he believed himself to be, couldn't resist. "Hello, beautiful," he said, approaching her with a confident smile. "How are you doing tonight?" Blessing looked up, pretending to be surprised. She flashed a shy smile. "I'm fine, thank you. And you?" "I'm much better now that I've seen you," Johnson replied smoothly. "What's your name?" "Blessing," she said, her voice soft and sweet. They exchanged numbers that night, with Johnson completely unaware that Blessing was part of a plan to expose him. As he walked away, feeling victorious, Blessing sent a quick text to Fanciful. He took the bait. Step 1 complete. From that moment, the trap was set. Blessing and Fanciful knew it would take patience and careful execution, but they were ready to take Johnson down. Little did he know, his days of freedom were numbered. As Blessing and Johnson's relationship grew, she became more of a fixture in his life. Each time they met, she would gather bits of information and update Fanciful on his movements. Blessing played her role so well that Johnson never suspected a thing. One evening, Blessing called Fanciful, her voice trembling with urgency. "Fanciful, you won't believe what I just overheard," she said. "What is it?" Fanciful asked, her heart racing. "Johnson is planning to kill me," Blessing revealed. "He was on the phone earlier, talking about taking me to a special location. From the tone of the conversation, I could tell it's not what it seems." Fanciful gasped. "Oh my God, Blessing. Are you safe? What are we going to do?" "Don't worry," Blessing said, regaining her composure. "I pretended like I didn't hear anything. He has no idea that I'm onto him. But we need to act fast. This is our chance to catch him red-handed." After a quick discussion, they decided to involve the police. This time, Fanciful ensured they worked with officers known for their integrity, men who couldn't be bought or intimidated. She explained the entire situation to the police, including Johnson's history and Blessing's role in gathering evidence. The officers took the case seriously. "We'll be ready," one of them assured Fanciful. "Just let us know when and where." Johnson had spent weeks preparing for this moment, thinking he had everything in control. His instruments were laid out neatly on a table in his room, ready to carry out the dreadful plan he had been plotting. He had even changed into a jalebia gown, convinced that everything was going smoothly. "Come to my room, my dear," he called out to Blessing, his voice filled with expectation. Blessing, already aware of his sinister plans, smiled to herself. She knew it was time to set everything in motion. "Please, let me take a shower first," she replied, stepping into the restroom. As soon as the door closed behind her, Blessing quickly texted Fanciful. "We are in house. He's about to make his move. Be ready." Fanciful, along with the police squad, was already stationed near Johnson's house, waiting for the right moment. They had planned everything carefully, and now the time had come. The police were no longer the corrupt ones Johnson had encountered before. This group was different, honest, diligent, and determined to see justice served. Blessing lingered in the restroom, pretending to be delayed. She knew the plan was working perfectly, and Johnson was getting impatient. Sure enough, he called out again. "Baby, I'm here," Johnson said, his voice filled with urgency. With a deep breath, Blessing stepped out of the restroom, smiling at him in a way that made him think everything was going according to plan. As soon as she approached, Johnson grabbed her forcefully, his hands moving to tie her up. But before he could make another move, the door to his room burst open. "Freeze. You're under arrest." The sound of the police command filled the room. Johnson's eyes widened in shock, but it was too late. The officers swiftly surrounded him, slapping handcuffs onto his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead officer said sternly. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Johnson struggled, trying to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. He had been caught red-handed, and there was no escaping now. With the police's swift action, they also managed to uncover the bigger criminal behind Johnson's operations, the powerful man who had been funding Johnson's terrible deeds. The truth came to light, and soon, the big man was arrested as well. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Fanciful, who had waited anxiously outside, breathed a sigh of relief when she saw the officers leading Johnson away. She couldn't believe it was finally over. Justice had been served. "Thank you, Blessing," Fanciful said, giving her best friend a heartfelt hug. "You were incredible. You helped me bring justice for my sister." Blessing smiled, her eyes full of satisfaction. "We did it together, Fanciful. We couldn't have done it without each other." When Fanciful's parents heard the news, they couldn't believe their ears. Their daughter's killer was behind bars, and their family could finally begin healing. "Thank you for everything," Fanciful's mother said, tears in her eyes as she embraced Fanciful. "We can finally have peace, thanks to you and Blessing." Fanciful felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Justice had been done, and she could now close the chapter on the pain caused by Johnson. But as they celebrated their victory, Fanciful couldn't help but wonder what other secrets Johnson had hidden. His connections had been vast, and though he was behind bars, there was always the possibility of someone else trying to continue his work. But for now, they could all rest easy, knowing that Johnson's reign of terror had finally come to an end. The truth had been uncovered, and the family could finally start to heal. The moral lesson of this story is that while evil may thrive for a time, truth and justice will always prevail. Greed, deception, and selfish ambition may seem rewarding in the moment, but they inevitably lead to ruin. Courage, perseverance, and an unwavering pursuit of justice, like Fanciful and Blessing demonstrated, can overcome even the darkest evils. Never underestimate the power of integrity and the importance of standing up for what is right, no matter how difficult the journey may seem. At the same time, young ladies must be careful and watchful about the relationships they enter into, learn from Fancy's story and don't fall victim. Not all that glitters is gold. Often, the most appealing offers hide the darkest intentions. Always wait for God's perfect timing, as His plans bring peace and joy without sorrow. Do not let the love of money cloud your judgment or blind you to potential dangers. Instead, value integrity, character, and God's guidance above material possessions. Finally, listen to wise counsel when it is given. Good advice can save your life and guide you to a path of true peace, fulfillment, and safety. This is the end of this story. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please share the video so that it will get to more people. Like, comment, and also subscribe to get more updates whenever I upload new video. See you in my next episode.